Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. It's just one decision after another daily life, though we're barely aware of most of the choices we make and often confused about those we are aware of. On the programme today, decision making, how it works, how it goes wrong, and how to do it when there doesn't seem to be a good choice at all. I'm joined by the brain surgeon Henry Marsh, whose book Do No Harm candidly admits that there are occasions when even an expert can't be sure what's the right thing to do. By the novelist and writer Lisa Opinionesi, here to talk about crimes of passion and changing attitudes to our responsibility for very bad choices, and by Michael Ignatieff, who's interested in the difference between political decisions and ethical ones. But we're starting with the acknowledged expert on how people make choices, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. There isn't a Nobel Prize for psychology, of course. He won it for economics and his work on prospect theory, which is about how humans weigh up risky alternatives. Professor Kahneman, humans is the critical word here, isn't it? Because central to your work is the idea that economics hadn't really been based on how real humans actually think.
Oh, if you mean humans as against what we call econs.
Yes, what is an econ? Because
that is really an imaginary species who behave according to the axioms of rationality. They really don't exist. On the other hand, humans, as part of the animal kingdom, many animals behave pretty much the way we do in many ways.
Now, essentially, the point was that economics, classical economics, had worked with econs. They'd thought that humans were essentially rational. I mean, you describe in your book reading an economic paper where the human being is, or the economic agent is described as rational, selfish, and essentially unchanging in their taste. So you, as a psychologist, were astounded at that anybody could think those three things were true.
Oh, yes, because it is really quite obvious to anyone who's been trained as a psychologist that people are not generally rational in the extreme sense. People are quite reasonable. So it's not that people are irrational. I really hate that characterization. People are quite reasonable. They're not rational according to the very extreme definition that economists give to that term.
Your book, Thinking Fast and Slow, explores some of these ideas in a more accessible way for a kind of general public. And one of the central ideas there is that you can divide the way in which we respond to a problem or a risk that we're looking at with System 1 and System 2 thinking. Could you just explain what those two are?
Well, yes. I mean, there is an obvious difference between two major ways in which ideas come to mind. So some ideas, I would say most ideas, come to mind automatically and quite effortlessly. So I say 2 plus 2, and you have a thought, the capital of Bulgaria, and a word comes to mind. But if I mention a computation like 17 times 24, you're going to stop if you're going to do it. It's going to take effort, it's going to take time, it's going to take obeying a set of rules and following them.
You give an example in your book which is quite striking, how you can see this in operation, that if somebody is walking along, employing System 1 systems, they're not thinking about walking, and if you then give them a complicated mathematical sum, quite a lot of people will stop in their tracks while they work it out. These two systems interact with each other in that way.
Well, absolutely. And the characteristic of what I call System 2 thinking is that it demands effort. And you can measure effort in many ways. So one of the manifestations is that people cannot do two things at once. So in the extreme case, they can't even walk and think.
Now, one of the consequences of System 2 thinking requiring effort is that mostly we like to avoid it. So we have a tendency to go for System 1 reactions.
Well, System 1 is really the dominant one, and it is operating all the time. And System 2 is effortless, and there is really what is called a law of least effort.
System 2 is effortful.
It's effortful, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And there is a law of least effort. Most of us, and there are individual differences. Some people are much more willing to exert mental effort than others, but most of us are quite lazy.
Now, it's much more complicated, isn't it, than System 1 being sort of, as it were, instinct and prejudice, and System 2 being rational and clear. because the problem is that many of our biases spill over into what we think of as being rational thought. You describe a lot of, you use the word heuristics, which essentially is a mental shortcut, isn't it? But those have a tendency to affect the way we think, even when we think we're thinking rationally.
Well, I would want to correct it almost the other way around. That is, that true expertise is system one. That is, the highest level of human thinking and the highest level of human creativity come automatically and effortlessly. And then it is also the case that System 1, which is specialized in providing answers, in providing quick answers to questions, will provide approximate answers when the precise ones are not available. And those approximate answers will frequently be incorrect.
But we are prey to a whole set of biases which make it very difficult for us to assess sort of rational questions. I mean, can we just talk about some of those, because they're rather fascinating? The anchoring effect, for example. You give an example of judges who are asked to sentence in a hypothetical case. Before they do this sentencing, they roll a set of loaded dice. And the judges who get the low figure on the dice tend to go lower than the judges who get the high figure on the set of dice. Rather terrifying thought, yes. That. But
well, what happens is that it is trying to understand what somebody says means trying to make sense of it. And so when I ask myself, should I sentence this individual to 8 months in jail, I'm trying to make sense of this as a plausible proposition. And trying to make sense of things means that later you are going to be anchored on that possibility, and trying to make sense of a very low sentence will have the opposite effect.
Is there a way round this bind? By knowing about it, do we free ourselves from these? There are lots of other biases, framing effects. You describe things called mental shotguns, which force your thinking down a certain path. If you know about them, are you exempt from them?
Some of them you can avoid, because some of them you are aware, this is an anchoring situation. So a number has been mentioned, and I'm trying to make sense of that number. So this number is going to have too much influence on my thinking. But when, somebody presents me with mortality statistics in terms of mortality, no one in their right mind will think, if they had mentioned the same statistics, but in terms of survival, I would have interpreted them differently.
Henry Marsh, this is absolutely pertinent to your experience as a surgeon, isn't it? In fact, you name-check Professor Kahneman's book in your book. It's important for you to know that.
Well, I think Professor Kahneman's book is custom-made to describe the doctor vivisecting, the surgical-patient relationship. I mean, it sounds a rather throwaway line to say that brain surgery is easy, but from a purely technical point of view, it's not really that difficult once you're reasonably experienced. But what I've found really difficult is the decision-making. And one thing I found very, very helpful in Professor Kahneman's book, which related very much to my own practice, is this default position that other people are better at recognizing my mistakes than I am. And in surgery, you're constantly sort of torn between, all surgeons are egotists, they're alpha males, they want to go out there and, do brilliant, clever operations. And yet, at the same time, the decision-making is so critical, it's very helpful, in fact, if you try to discuss everything with your colleagues. And the usual model in medicine has been discussions after the event, the so-called morbidity and mortality meetings, where you all sit down and look at the bad results and resolve this won't happen again. But actually it's much better if you can discuss the decisions before they're made, and I try to do that to some extent in my department. But actually this is very unusual.
You also have the ability, though, to affect the decisions, because going back to what Professor Kahneman was talking about, the way in which you present a risk statistic to a patient will hugely affect the decision they make.
No, that's another aspect, is how you... first of all, the surgeon has to decide what the right decision should be, and if you can discuss it with colleagues, I think that often is a very good idea. Often you can't, for various reasons. But then the second question is how you discuss this question of risk with patients, and in brain surgery, which is kind of triple X surgery, and because it's so dangerous, It's very difficult. How can poor patients say, so there's a 5% risk you could die or be left terribly disabled?
But you know as a surgeon that if you go in and say there's a 95% chance this operation is going to be successful, they are more likely to sign the consent.
And my non-verbal, my physical bit, my non-verbal communication is vital.
Michael Ignati, if this comes into play in politics all the time, doesn't it?
My whole political career could be an example of optimism bias. That is, overestimating my abilities, underestimating the difficulties. But that raises an issue, which is that some of this failure to correctly predict risk is extremely important. You wouldn't get out of bed if you knew what you were in for, and sometimes the risks that you have to take as a patient will save your life. And so that's one of the things I find fascinating about this, that if we had correct, always predictive rationality, we wouldn't take any risks at all, and yet you can't live without risk. There's some irony in this story that I find completely fascinating. You're shaking, Professor Kahneman shaking his head. I've obviously got something wrong.
No, you didn't get anything wrong. It's just that when we take risks, there are biases of really two kinds, and that work against each other. One is our fear of losses is much more salient than the appeal of gains. And so we tend to be loss averse, and that makes us averse to risks. And that gets compensated by excessive optimism. So you have two biases in decision making, which in a rather fortunate way work against each other, so that we end up taking risks but not fully aware that we're taking them.
Do they can't simply cancel each other out, can they?
No, that would be too fortunate. They don't. In any one occasion, one or the other will be more salient than it should be.
Lisa, opinionate.
I would love to have Professor Kahneman's view on the kinds of decision-making that take place in the courtroom, which is the theatre that I'm most concerned with in my new book. And because it seems to me that there's different kinds of decision-making that come into play here. The law itself has a bias towards the rational and a bias towards presupposing that the person in the dock is also a rational being. In fact, most of the people who appear in the dock are like all the rest of us, but perhaps even more so, not particularly rational. And then there's the hope that both judge and jury will be able to come to a reason-based decision on evidence. And then there's all the influence that comes from a hugely, to me, irrational press, or at least a sensationalizing, fictionalizing press that plays into these decisions. So how do you arrive at a kind of sensible outcome in this kind of decision-making?
By luck, I think. I mean, it is. There is really no guarantee, given all these influences, that you can.
It's very interesting how you write about luck in your book, because you give it a much greater role in life and indeed even in rational decisions. And that's something that's true of you, Henry Marsh.
As a surgeon, the more experienced I've become, the more I feel what happens is largely determined by luck.
When I read that, I remembered the thing that Gary Player, the golf player, once said. And he said, somebody said, "Oh, that was a lucky shot." And he said, "Funny, the more I practice, the luckier I get."
Yes.
Yours is a different case, isn't it? You are really saying it genuinely is luck. I mean, it's partly you're getting more skilled, but also you now.
Yes, a lot of it is luck, in the sense that there are certain sorts of difficult brain tumours I operate upon, where really what determines the outcome of the operation is the physical consistency of the tumour. And you could say that's a question of luck. You're lucky if you've been given a tumour which is easy to remove. You're unlucky if it's difficult.
Well, it's always going to be the case. By the time you've done everything you can do, the rest is up to luck.
Exactly.
Is this something you ever express to your patients?
No. I mean, the problem it depends on the diagnosis, the problem you're dealing with. But the other side of risk is this question of hope. And if you have it's a problem many of us will face sooner or later, because 3 out of 4 of us are going to get cancer, and most diseases nowadays are not cured, they're treated. And then you have to decide, am I going to have a nasty course of chemotherapy and radiotherapy? And what determines your choice? Now, I've spent some years sitting on a government committee which it's not really my field, of health economics, where you have pure econ standard Gamble von Neumann theory to assess utilities of different drugs. But what I think often determines patients' decision when they have chemotherapy for cancer is they hope there'll be a statistical outlier. They hope there'll be the one or two people who get the miraculous result, rather than making a rational decision. But the probability is they'll get an extra 3 months.
Well, there is this odd perversity, isn't there? You're very often presenting patients and saying, well, there is a 5% chance of this operation going wrong. They know, as you point out in your book, that if it goes wrong, they're going to end up 100% dead.
Yes,
and
exactly. It's still a 5% risk for me. So.
Michael Ignatieff.
I found reading both Daniel Kahneman's book and Professor Marsh's book absolutely fascinating lessons, I guess, in humility. That is, that you're a neurosurgeon practicing incredibly dangerous and risky stuff. And I thought it was very impressive that you were prepared to talk about surgical stage fright, that is, deep uncertainty in yourself as you perform something and stepping away from the godlike role that we assume doctors to have. And I thought that was a fantastic thing, because it, I think, will change the way patients understand the experience of risk and decision. And I also thought, reading Professor Kahneman's book, which I teach my students, I use it really to teach them humility, prudence, that old traditional word about prudence, that is, checking your intuitions, checking for biases, taking it slow if you have to. It's especially important to do that because I teach 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds, and you're never more certain of your impulses at 25 than you will later on. And so I get from both of you a kind of a big, big important message about cognitive and moral humility here, and also, finally, a sense bad things do happen. Bad things happen, and you have to understand that really bad things can happen, and just that's life.
There's a crude sort of received sense, I think, that System 2 thinking, rationality, careful, cautious, prudent, is the more ethical. But I was very interested in your book, Henry Marsh, that you have to close down some of those intuitions, don't you, as a surgeon? You have to close down all sorts of automatic empathies, all sorts of automatic responses to the other human being in order to be able to do your job
There's
well.
a fundamental dichotomy, I think, in medicine, which is the ethical imperative clearly is you should only treat patients as you would wish to be treated yourself or members of your family to be treated. But it is almost impossible to operate upon people you know well. I once did. There was a very simple biopsy operation of a malignant brain tumour, in fact one of my daughter's godmother, and it was a totally simple operation. It was almost impossible. I was so nervous. So the question is how you combine these, find a balance between this. And I've sometimes become too attached to patients. You can make the wrong decision because you like them too much, or you just can't accept that the end is coming, and you over-treat people.
Lisa Binianesi.
I'm curious about this because I'm so interested in other kinds of psychology as well as Professor Kahneman's. But it seems to me that one of the things that happens with surgery is that you have to be distant from your patient and present them with so-called statistical information, which will allow them to choose reasonably. And yet a great part of medicine itself is to do with the relationship between the patient and the doctor appearing as a kind of magician, if you like, or what we used to call a witch doctor, in relationship to that patient, so that he can deliver what we now call the placebo effect as well. I don't know where you stand in relationship to that other kind of, if you like, the art of medicine.
Well, I believe enormously in the importance of a good bedside manner. I think less anxious patients who can sleep at night, which none of them can do in hospitals in this country on the whole, recover better and do better in general terms. And what's often interpreted as surgical arrogance is sort of self-protection. But the trouble is, of course, power corrupts, and I mean, doctors do easily get corrupted. And because patients put them on pedestals, they think they really are on a pedestal.
We need Michael's moral humility.
As your career has gone on, do you nudge your patients towards the decision you think they should take more or less?
It depends on the work you do. As if it's a pain problem, I operate on a condition called trigeminal neuralgia, which is an agonizing facial pain, which is classically said to be the most painful. I'd imagine it's rather like having a dentist drilling constantly into an unanaesthetised tooth. And in the past, people would commit suicide because of it. And there are various different sorts of treatment, and the most effective treatment actually is open brain surgery, but it comes at some risk. But then I go out of my way to tell patients, I'm not telling you what, there's your choice. These are the options. But there are other things with difficult brain tumours and the like, where sometimes it's quite clear what should be done. The real problems arise is when I myself actually don't know. In a lot of areas, you don't have clear statistics as to what the right thing to do is. And then the question is, do you pretend to a certainty you don't have, and you tell the patient this is what we should do, even though actually I don't know? Or do you tell the patient, well, actually, we don't know, which is pretty shattering for the patient. And a lot of these conversations, I specialise in dealing with tumour, I go into the outpatient room not knowing what the conclusion will be, and you have a sort of exploratory discussion with the patient, and it's all very unclear.
Lisa Opinionesi, I want to turn to you now. You've written about crimes of passion, which is, again, an unclear area, a vague area of human psychology. And this is the growing notion that we may not be responsible for all of the actions we take. Just tell us about some of the cases you describe, because they're sensational cases. They're hugely publicised at the time they're on, and the courtroom becomes a kind of discussion theatre in which these ideas evolve, doesn't it?
That's right. I mean, part of the impetus to this book is not only to describe, if you like, this very dramatic theatre of the courtroom, but also the way in which the law, in combination with the judges and jury and the journalists who report it, and the expert psychiatric witnesses who come into being in the course of the 19th century, how all these people change the way we think about human volition and the way we think about passion and indeed about sexuality and the way in which we change our notion of what it is to behave as a sexed or gendered person. So that sounds rather complicated, but in fact all it means, if you like, in the playing out of it, is that a kind of woman in the 1870s who decides quite deliberately and rationally that the way to get her man is to poison that man's wife, and evolves a completely a logical system of doing this. I would like to hear what you think about what kind of action that is, or what kind of decision-making that is.
She was called Christiana Edmonds, wasn't
Christiana
she?
Edmonds.
She attempted to force a poisoned chocolate into her kind of rival, her love rival's mouth.
Right.
Then it becomes very embarrassing. Yeah. Well, in order to cover this up, she then embarks on a sort of mass poisoning of random people in Brighton.
That's right, in order to prove to her perhaps fantasy lover, a doctor, that in fact she is innocent of this attempt to kill his wife. She launches this great campaign of poisoning throughout the whole city, through these wonderful chocolates and sweetmeats and so on. And she does this very, very rationally, because it's difficult at that point in history to obtain strychnine. It's difficult for a woman to go about alone and to do these acts.
She does it systematically, but not necessarily rationally. Surely that's the distinction, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think there's a kind of rationality that exists within delusion, and this is what I would like to ask Professor Kahneman about, because it seems to me that indeed in politics, quite often, I mean, as we think now about the Ukraine and what's going on there is a kind
Michael Ignatieff has a wry look on his face, which I think acknowledges the truth of what he's saying.
A logical procedure within complete delusion, or what seems to other people to be complete delusion. And this is, in my case, where the mind doctors come in and become the experts on passion and emotion and say this person is insane and therefore
the intriguing thing, particularly with Christiana Edmonds, is that they're starting from a position in which they don't really regard women in general as being necessarily rational actors. I mean, the prejudice of the time says that essentially women are teetering on the brink of rationality anyway, and any woman who expresses sexual desire must, in a sense, be mad.
Yes, they're not your homo econ. Certainly not. They're frail and subject to nerves, and indeed get away with what we would now consider to be quite horrific crimes, like, shooting a newspaper editor for printing the wrong kinds of information about your husband.
Michael Ignatieff, why did you raise your eyebrows in the midst of that?
Well, I think the allusion was to Crimea, and there it seems to me you're dealing with a set of highly rational strategic actions. I mean, the reoccupation of the Crimea, Putin is not insane. The thing that is truly frightening is that he's prepared to gamble with consequences that he might think he can control but can't control at all. And the casualness with which he's prepared to put the lives of millions of people, and Dr. Marsh knows about Ukraine better than I do, the ways in which he's prepared to gamble with lives seems to me to be... So it's a combination of rational geostrategy combined with this kind of indifferent, callous indifference to consequence, which is genuinely alarming, I think.
Well, I was very struck reading your book, Professor Kahneman, that you write about what happens when people have no good choices. And when people have no good choices, they become much greater gamblers. That was one of your findings, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, clearly, rather than acknowledge a sure loss, this is actually an excellent example of that. That is, when people have to choose between a sure loss and the possibility of a larger loss, but probability of a larger loss, but with some possibility of coming out even or even gaining, they tend to be gamblers. And, most people who would be conservative when dealing with gains tend to be gamblers when dealing with losses. And this is very clearly Putin's situation.
I don't think that, not guilty by reason of insanity works in the International Court of Human Rights, does it? It's never been tried yet.
Not yet. It may, rise and rise of the mind doctors.
There would be a huge outcry if it was, because one of the subjects of your book is the deep human resistance to the idea that we may escape culpability, that we may escape responsibility for our actions, and it's in every single case you describe there is a controversy over whether the insanity plea is eligible or not.
That's right, because responsibility is, after all, crucial to the way in which we administer the law. But, responsibility comes in many forms, and we see this in politics as well as in the theatre of the courtroom, in passionate cases. I mean, the reason I chose passion to work with is simply that it is extreme emotion. And we don't tend to think of extreme emotion in the courtroom as something that we don't think of it as something that can be adjudicated. We think people just, fall in love, they have passion, and that's all fine.
Well,
but there's a malign side to...
Different legal systems do recognise it in different ways. The French have always recognised passion, haven't they, to a much greater degree.
They recognised it, first of all, more for men than for women, because women were not supposed to experience it.
Really?
Yes.
Crimes of passion
well,
men?
Men were allowed to have control, if you like, of their wives' lives, and if the wife was unfaithful, then a crime of passion by the male would be all right.
That was honour rather than passion.
But honour, it's
so outraged their sense of honour that they...
Honour works for women at this period of the Bailey book as well. I mean, women have reputation to maintain. The point is that the jury has to think that reputation is what a true woman is meant to be, i.e. a domestic angel.
One of your cases is the shooting of Stanford White in America. It's a hugely successful architect, fantastic tabloid story at the time. One of the interesting things there is that one of the lawyers there makes a distinction between two possible verdicts: guilty but insane, and not guilty by reason of insanity. It's a very interesting distinction, that, isn't it? In one case you say, well, you are responsible, but you're not going to suffer the consequences.
You're not responsible, but the consequences you will suffer, because these people, don't forget, if they're insane, are still confined. It's just a different form of confinement, and it's one which allows society to say we are charitable to people who suffer in this way, who aren't in control of their reason. Again, reason has a great and different weight in these cases than perhaps it does in other spheres of life, the economic or the political. But I think the function, the mental function, may not be all that different.
Henry Marsh, what do you feel?
Well, I mean, Lisa mentions towards the end of her book this rising field of neurocriminology. I'd be very interested to know what Professor Kahneman thinks about the idea of free will. Actually, I didn't understand what free will is supposed to be. And as a physicalist, as far as I'm concerned, everybody's brain is different. So clearly criminals different brains from non-criminals. So what?
But
and it seems to me revenge is always all tied up with.
But where do you take your idea of criminality? Because in certain jurisdictions, some things are criminal that we would consider okay, and in others not.
Well,
for example, if you're working under Nazi law,
yeah.
and the law says that certain things are okay for you to do, i.e., kill ABC. I don't want to go into this, but in order to be a responsible person under a different jurisdiction, you would not commit those heinous acts. And yet within that regime, the law says this is the way you... I don't know what the brain does with that. I don't think the brain, or at least our understanding of the brain and neurology, has yet arrived at this point.
But there's the other critical question. You quote Oscar Wilde, I think quoting Henty, I was no longer captain of my soul. Talking about his own irresponsible behaviour. That's the critical thing, isn't it? We have to think there's a captain on the bridge. And
Freud said you're not a master. Yeah. We're no longer masters in our own house.
Ultimately, there always is the possibility, I did it because my brain made me do it. So that is available to anyone at all times. And so where to draw the line...
Well, that's the problem, is that once you start down that slope, it's very...
It strikes me as entirely arbitrary. That is, where you draw the line is arbitrary, but it has consequences for society. That is, you draw the line in a way that society can go on to exist, even if free will is a fiction. It is a necessary fiction.
Michael Ignatieff.
Well, it's a necessary fiction, but I wondered what Professor Kahneman thought about Professor Marsh's physicalism. That is, that it's all just wet stuff, and whether you're convinced by attempts to locate in the wet stuff, in the neurological stuff, system 1, system 2, some of the behaviors that you have so brilliantly analyzed, whether you actually think there are physical correlates of this stuff.
I'm convinced there are.
Well, there has to be.
There has to be, but actual physical...
Yeah. But I think what Michael Ignatieff is asking is there a section of the brain that is system 1 and a section that is system 2?
I don't believe so. We know about some areas, especially about system 2. We know that some areas are involved in it, but no, the
brain is
awfully
not complicated and it's massively interconnected. Yeah. But I mean
which is to say, we simply don't know what those connections are, but it has to. Exactly. It has to start with a physical cause.
The other way is one bit in my book where I discuss this. I mean, as neuroscience tells us, if thought is a physical process, it's a fact. There's no getting away from it. But many people think this is reductionist. It means we haven't got free will. It means we're just automata. It's all just atoms. It's atoms. It's electricity. But it also means we don't understand matter, because actually nobody knows how consciousness or thought arises from matter. But it does.
But it is too early, surely, within the neurological sphere to make any large claims.
Far too early.
And if we ever will be able to do that, because of course, the culture effect is there.
We have to fall back on
and
introspection.
Provides different languages.
Which is very fallible. I mean, I want to turn to you, Michael Ignatieff. You had a very crucial decision to make. You write about it in your book, Fire and Ashes, which is an account of your political career in Canada, which started on an upward ascent and ended on a downward ascent.
Indeed it did.
You write very interestingly about the moment at which this idea is first put to you, and you talk about getting an offer from the Men in Black. It's a very Faustian way of writing that. Did you think about it at the time as being a Faustian deal?
Well, it is in a little way an interesting decision. I was teaching at Harvard, extremely happy, not suffering a middle-life crisis, happily married, absolutely fine, and somebody literally comes out of the blue, 3 people I'd never met, sit me down for dinner and said, would you like to leave Harvard and go into Canadian politics? And the interesting point about this decision is the words had hardly got out of their mouth before I knew that my answer would be yes. And that's, in retrospect, I think, the most disturbing aspect of the decision is that I took it almost instantaneously. And the reasons for it had to do with the fact that, family. My dad had been a public servant. I'd worked for Prime Minister Trudeau. There was a lot of it seemed to surge up within me in a kind of automatic response. And it was definitely System 1 time, and it should have been System 2, and System 2 should have said, what, I mean, who do you think you are would have been a good question. Do you have any idea what you're getting into? I mean, I did okay. I became the leader of one of Canada's largest parties. I'm proud to have done it. But I can't see it now as anything but hubris in the classic sense of the word. And in some sense, I wrote the book just to say this is what hubris really looks like.
The interesting thing is that System 2 thinking did come into play, but it got you deeper into trouble because you're a clever man. You had no problems in coming up with rationalizations for doing what you were doing.
Yes, and in some sense, I was never a natural in politics. A lot of great politicians have a kind of natural, I would say, System 1 capacity to just come up with stuff. I constantly overthought things, having made an initially impulsive decision, which I, in a way, would still defend. I'm glad I did it, but I was not well prepared for what I was getting into. I think I then overcompensated by becoming very cautious. I kind of suited up and, I literally kind of changed my personality to reduce the risk factors because it wasn't coming naturally. A great politician has a kind of natural verve, which is what attracts people to you. I didn't have it. I began to shut that down and get much more cautious than I should have been. And so you can make mistakes both ways. You can overthink in politics, and you can, as I did in the first case, underthink.
You actually write at one point, knowing an issue in your guts, not just in your head, is the critical political skill that you have to be able to assess. I mean, to an extent, it's assessing what other people are feeling, not what they're thinking, but what they're feeling.
Yes. I think what I'm trying to do is describe. This is a book in praise of politics, although it didn't go so well for me. I learned to have enormous respect for what we call the gut instinct of a good politician. It's somewhat analogous, I think, to the gut instinct of a really good neurosurgeon. They're kind of things that you just know, that you can't even articulate, but you just have a kind of instinct, a feeling for them. I never really acquired that myself in politics, but at a distance I could see what it would look like and feel like. That kind of gut instinct that is not, mastery of policy. It's just a feeling for the people, a feeling for what's possible, a feeling for what's not possible at this moment. It's propositional, situational knowledge. A sense of what you can do in this room and not in another room, which is an enormous. But we're so down on politicians for excellent reasons. Regard them with appropriate cynicism. I think that's good. But the skill of a great politician is a wonder. It's a skill it's not as august as brain surgery. It's not as august as brain surgery, but it is a very, very particular skill. And I certainly didn't have it, but it's a book in praise of those who do have it.
But do you think academics are not... I mean, have there been successful academics in politics?
Not many is the answer. And
is that part of the problem?
And I'm a further confirmation of that general rule.
But I don't think it has to be a general rule, and I do think there's an element of luck in all of this and timing. You were asked to enter politics rather late in life, and perhaps if you'd been asked 10 years earlier, and in a slightly different political configuration, it might have come out differently. Certainly your reflections on the difficulties that you encountered are extraordinarily interesting for, I think, all politicians as well as for the rest of us. But I do think there is an element of luck in all of this. I don't think it is. I mean, why is our present Prime Minister our Prime Minister? There's a lot of luck in that.
But the thing about luck is, yes, a great politician makes his luck is the phrase, and there's some truth in that. And the other function of the word luck is self-exculpation. You're always saying, well, it's just bad luck that I didn't make it. I'd love to claim that it was all bad luck, but I've got a lot that I just have to own up to. So luck has a very ambiguous moral function in our judgments about our own lives. I think I did suffer from just bad timing and bad luck, but damn it, it was my luck and I didn't make it.
Well, it's the same with bad results in surgery. If you want to take all the praise and glory for a good result, then you have to take the blame for a bad result.
Yes.
If you say it's luck, was just luck, it was a good result, was luck.
Many people manage to do one without doing it.
I think they do. Surgeons are very good at it.
Well, we've got a lot of candour around the table. You very candidly admit that by the end of the election campaign, the presidential election campaign, you were essentially creating framing effects, as Professor Kahneman talks, for yourself. You were addressing only loyal crowds.
Yes.
And so then you became convinced that things were going much better than they...
Yes, it was rather comic. The most fun I ever had in politics was the 35 days of the election in which I lost catastrophically. Go figure. I had a wonderful time. I had a wonderful campaign. I loved every second of it. I felt I was on my game. I felt I finally commanded all the skills necessary to succeed in politics. And we had the worst record in the history of my party. So there you go. You just have to fess up. And the book tries to fess up about how that could possibly happen. And some of it is framing effects, and some of it's just what could also be called the bubble effect. Yeah. You get in a bubble and you convince yourself you're doing a fabulous job.
Most politicians won't admit to that delusion.
Well.
You recognise the bubble effect, Professor Kahneman.
Well, yes. I mean, clearly you put yourself in a situation where all the information that you receive is pre-selected to support what you do.
Yeah.
What you said earlier was really quite interesting, I thought, about the skills of the politician. And that is a System 1 operation. It is not System 2.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And another aspect of it is that the public wants that in a politician. The public prefers System 1 politicians to System 2 politicians.
System 1.
It all depends, doesn't it? Some people prefer Putin's System 1 thinking, others are not so sure. Anyway, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you to all of my guests. Daniel Kahneman is giving a talk on his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, tomorrow evening at the Methodist Central Hall in London. Michael Ignatieff will be at King's College London tonight and Chatham House on Wednesday to talk about international intervention, and his memoir Fire and Ashes was published in the autumn. Henry Marsh's Do No Harm is out now, and Lisa Opinionesi Trials of Passion will be published in April. That's all for now. Thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Just talk about some of those because they're rather fascinating. The anchoring effect, for example. You give an example of judges who are asked to sentence in a hypothetical case. Before they do this sentencing, they roll a set of loaded dice. And the judges who get the low figure on the dice tend to go lower than the judges who get the high figure on the set of dice. Rather terrifying thought, yes. That. But
well, you know, what happens is that it is trying to understand what somebody says means trying to make sense of it. And so when I ask myself, should I sentence this individual to 8 months in jail, I'm trying to make sense of this as a plausible proposition. And trying to make sense of things means that later you are going to be anchored on that possibility. And trying to make sense of a very low sentence will have the opposite effect.
Is there a way round this bind? By knowing about it, do we free ourselves from these? There are lots of other biases, framing effects. You describe things called mental shotguns, which force your thinking down a certain path. If you know about them, are you exempt from them?
Some of them you can avoid, because some of them you are aware, oh, this is an anchoring situation. So a number has been mentioned, and I'm trying to make sense of that number. So this number is going to have too much influence on my thinking. But when, System 2 is effortless, and there is really what is called a law of least effort.
System 2 is effortful.
Is effortful, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And there is a law of least effort. Most of us, and there are individual differences. Some people are much more willing to exert mental effort than others, but most of us are quite lazy.
Now, it's much more complicated, isn't it, than System 1 being sort of, as it were, instinct and prejudice, and System 2 being rational and clear, because the problem is that many of our biases spill over into what we think of as being rational thought. You describe a lot of... You use the word heuristics, which essentially is a mental shortcut, isn't it? But those have a tendency to affect the way we think, even when we think we're thinking rationally.
Well, I would want to correct it almost the other way around. That is, that true expertise is System 1. That is, the highest level of human thinking and the highest level of human creativity come automatically and effortlessly. And then it is also the case that System 1, which is specialized in providing answers, in providing quick answers to questions, will provide approximate answers when the precise ones are not available. And those approximate answers will frequently be incorrect.
But we are prey to a whole set of biases which make it very difficult for us to assess sort of rational questions. I mean, can we...
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. It's just one decision after another daily life, though we're barely aware of most of the choices we make and often confused about those we are aware of. On the programme today, decision making, how it works, how it goes wrong, and how to do it when there doesn't seem to be a good choice at all. I'm joined by the brain surgeon Henry Marsh, whose book Do No Harm candidly admits that there are occasions when even an expert can't be sure what's the right thing to do. By the novelist and writer Lisa Opinionesi, here to talk about crimes of passion and changing attitudes to our responsibility for very bad choices, and by Michael Ignatieff, who's interested in the difference between political decisions and ethical ones. But we're starting with the acknowledged expert on how people make choices, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. There isn't a Nobel Prize for psychology, of course. He won it for economics and his work on prospect theory, which is about how humans weigh up risky alternatives. Professor Kahneman, humans is the critical word here, isn't it? Because central to your work is the idea that economics hadn't really been based on how real humans actually think.
Oh, if you mean humans as against what we call econs. I mean,
yes, what is an econ? Because
that is really an imaginary species who behave according to the axioms of rationality. They really don't exist. On the other hand, humans, as part of the animal kingdom, many animals behave pretty much the way we do in many ways.
Now, essentially, the point was that economics, classical economics, had worked with econs. They'd thought that humans were essentially rational. I mean, you describe in your book reading an economic paper where the human being or the economic agent is described as rational, selfish, and essentially unchanging in their taste. So you, as a psychologist, were astounded at that anybody could think those three things were true.
Oh, yes, because it is really quite obvious to anyone who's been trained as a psychologist that people are not generally rational in the extreme sense. People are quite reasonable. So it's not that people are irrational. I really hate that characterization. People are quite reasonable. They're not rational according to the very extreme definition that economists give to that term.
Your book, Thinking Fast and Slow, explores some of these ideas in a more accessible way for a kind of general public. And one of the central ideas there is that you can divide the way in which we respond to a problem or a risk that we're looking at with System 1 and System 2 thinking. Could you just explain what those two are?
Well, yes. I mean, there is an obvious difference between two major ways in which ideas come to mind. So some ideas, I would say most ideas, come to mind automatically and quite effortlessly. So I say 2 plus 2, and you have a thought, the capital of Bulgaria, and a word comes to mind. But if I mention a computation like 17 times 24, you're going to stop if you're going to do it. It's going to take effort, it's going to take time, it's going to take obeying a set of rules and following them.
You give an example in your book which is quite striking, how you can see this in operation, that if somebody is walking along, employing System 1 systems, they're not thinking about walking, and if you then give them a complicated mathematical sum, quite a lot of people will stop in their tracks while they work it out. These two systems interact with each other in that way.
Well, absolutely. And the characteristic of what I call System 2 thinking is that it demands effort. And you can measure effort in many ways. So one of the manifestations is that people cannot do two things at once. So in the extreme case, they can't even walk and think.
Now, one of the consequences of System 2 thinking requiring effort is that mostly we like to avoid it. So we have a tendency to go for System 1 reactions.
Well, System 1 is really the dominant one, and it is operating all the time.